Most people know the story. It may be the most famous account of a birth in human history. One evening, an angel comes to tell a young woman that she is to be pregnant, despite still being a virgin. She is affianced already to a man. Luckily, the man does not send the virgin named Mary away and stays by her side. Later, a census required Joseph, the husband, to return with his betrothed to Bethlehem, his ancestral home. Shortly before arriving at their destination, the young Mary starts to go into labor. They arrive at their destination only to find that there is not room for them. They end up occupying the manger so that she could have somewhere to birth her miracle baby. As shepherds guarded their flocks that night, Mary gave birth to her son Jesus. Meanwhile, 3 wise men from the east noticed the appearance of a new star in the sky. They followed the star, which led them directly to the new baby Jesus. There, they gifted him with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This is the beginning of the earthly journey of the Jewish Messiah. Would it surprise you that none of this account is present in the earliest gospel of the New Testament? Why would an event key to establishing the messianic pedigree of Jesus and a miracle in itself be completely excluded from the earliest gospel? Stay tuned. We shall answer these questions today in this, our second in our series on Mark. Dated to about 70 CE, or AD for those of us born before the turn of the millennium, Mark is widely accepted by historians to be our earliest gospel. Well, in the New Testament canon anyway. By the time Mark was written, Paul's letters were already circulating amongst Christian communities. Those letters focused primarily on the death and resurrection of Jesus rather than the details of his ministry. Mark appears to fill that gap by providing a narrative account of Jesus' public career. While Mark did a good job giving an outline of Jesus' ministry and crucifixion, other communities had needs that Mark simply couldn't cover. Thus, historians believe Matthew and Luke used Mark as the primary source, forming the backbone of both Gospels. 90% of Mark is in Matthew, and somewhere around 50 or 60% is in Luke. The concept of Mark being necessary for both Matthew and Luke is called Markan priority, and is very well accepted by historians. Mark opens with Jesus being around 30 years old. Introducing John the Baptist, Mark opens at the occasion of Jesus' baptism, as Mark 1 and 2, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, "I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way." In addition to being the earliest gospel, Mark is also the shortest. From the baptism of Jesus, Mark moves rapidly through the events of his ministry, from formation until burial. His pacing is often described as being rushed and feeling unfinished due to this rapid-fire recitation of the events of Jesus' adult life. This may be due to its attribution as a recitation or a collection of the information being taught by Peter on his mission stops, rather than a more literary work. Perhaps what is even more notable is what Mark does not contain. Readers of Matthew and Luke will notice some glaring omissions. When Mark began by the Jordan River in the wilderness, Matthew and Luke begin in Bethlehem with the birth of Jesus. Mark does not include anything about a virgin giving birth, following a star, Bethlehem, genealogies, censuses, teenage Jesus in the temple, mangers, shepherds, wise men, or the slaughter of any innocents. Of course, Matthew and Luke do not agree on these details either. In fact, they are quite different. Matthew has Mary and Joseph apparently already living in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. Wise men noticed the appearance of a star and followed it to Herod the Great's palace, where they inquired about the location of the Messiah. They eventually find Mary in Bethlehem and bestow the baby Jesus with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Herod, tipped off about the birth of a new king of the Jews, sends soldiers to kill every Jewish boy younger than a toddler. This triggers a flight to Egypt, a la Moses, by Mary to escape the slaughter of the innocents, which most historians regard as a theological narrative rather than a historical event. They later return after the death of Herod and set up shop in Nazareth, where Jesus lives until his ministry begins. Luke also takes some historical liberties in his birth narrative. Luke has Mary and Joseph living in Nazareth until a census is declared. This census required Joseph and Mary to make the 90-mile journey to Joseph's ancestral home in Bethlehem to be counted. Note, the census, as described by Luke, is not known from any historical source and does not resemble how Roman censuses were normally conducted. At the end of their week-long journey, Mary goes into labor and is forced to give birth in a common area being used to house the animals. Luke does not include any magi, or wise men, in his account, opting instead to have shepherds notice the appearance of the new star. This actually may give us the approximate time of year Jesus was born, but that's for a later video. Also, unlike Mark, both Luke and Matthew offer differing genealogies in order to demonstrate Jesus of Nazareth's Davidic lineage. Historians have generally classified these as narrative devices, basically fiction, in order to demonstrate that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. This is largely due to neither genealogy adhering to the genealogical norms of the day. Mark also lacks any actual resurrection account or appearances by Jesus after his burial. While Mark does seem to imply this, it stops short of actually stating it. People die equally on all days of the week, often just before the Sabbath. The idea of a temporary burial in the nearest acceptable location until the Sabbath concludes was a reasonably common event. A temporary burial before the Sabbath would not have been unusual in first century Judea. Some historians have suggested that Mark's original ending leaves room for multiple interpretations before later Gospels provide explicit resurrection appearances. Matthew and Luke do away with the doubt and give distinct accounts of Jesus' resurrection and later appearance to his faithful companions. Jesus' virgin birth, resurrection from the dead, and ascension into heaven are three details no modern Christian would ever dream of leaving out of their gospel. In fact, these details are key to the very identity of the religion. Why would they not be present in the earliest gospel? The answer may be found in the tradition about the composition of Mark. According to John the Elder, via Papias of Hierapolis through Eusebius, Mark was the sermons of Peter as recorded by his translator John Mark. Whether this tradition is historically accurate is debated, but it is our earliest explanation for the origin of Mark. This would be about as close to eyewitness testimony about Jesus as anyone could really hope for. Peter was the missionary component of the so-called Jerusalem Church, headed by James the Just, Jesus' brother. They appear to have emphasized the teachings of Jesus and the practical implications of his message more than later writers would emphasize questions about his pre-existence, divine nature, or miraculous birth. Mark gives us a nice sense of this as it is basically an account of the ministry of Jesus. One possible explanation is that the birth traditions were either unknown to Mark or not considered important enough to include. By the time Matthew and Luke were written, however, traditions about Jesus' birth had clearly become important. Both authors felt the need to explain how Jesus could be both from Nazareth and yet fulfill expectations that the Messiah would be associated with Bethlehem. Curiosity about the aspects and nature of Jesus grew together with the booming popularity of the new religion, possibly giving birth to new traditions. We see this by contrasting the three Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels all agree reasonably closely as to the teachings of Jesus, but the stories of genealogy, birth, childhood, and resurrections do not agree much at all. That is, the teachings of Jesus are remarkably stable across the Synoptic Gospels. The birth narratives are not. The genealogies are not. The childhood stories are not. This has led many historians to suspect that the traditions about Jesus' birth and early life developed later than the traditions about his ministry. Perhaps the most important question is not whether Matthew and Luke believed these stories. They almost certainly did. The question is why the earliest gospel appears to completely be unaware of them. Mark begins with an adult Jesus arriving at the Jordan River. No Bethlehem, no shepherds, wise men, star, nor virgin birth. As the story of Jesus spread throughout the ancient world, Christians became increasingly interested not only in what Jesus taught, but who he was. Questions about his birth, lineage, childhood, and divine origins became more important. New traditions emerged, old traditions evolved, and different communities preserved different memories. Whether one views these accounts as history, theology, or some combination of the two, the silence of Mark remains one of the most fascinating mysteries in the New Testament.